Hey all, hope all is well. This is another video in the Road to Grandmaster series, and this one I'm going over my round 5 game from the Reykjavik Open. Now, if you watched the round 4 video, you know that I won kind of shaky game with white, but was happy to win it. And after that, I had won 2 games in a row to sort of get out of the doghouse. So now is my opportunity again to play up. So my opponent in this one was actually none other than Grandmaster Alexandr Fier, who's actually been a very strong Grandmaster and has pretty much been very active on the open circuit for years, it seems. Although I know he's Brazilian, so I actually wonder if he's actually living in Brazil. I have a feeling he's somewhere in Europe because he's playing so often in Europe. So I don't know, just a feeling there. But very, very well known for his attacking prowess, and I can actually recall seeing some games of his when I was much younger, so a real treat to play a player of his caliber. In any case, I was black, and I need to be very alert because this guy is super, super aggressive, and I need to stay on my P's and Q's, so yeah. Anyways, let's get into it. White went knight f3. This was actually a surprise for me. I thought he was going to go e4. If you're a super aggressive attacking player, typically e4 is the move you play. But knight f3, I think he was opting for a different type of game today. Or perhaps he saw some type of hole in my preparation he wanted to exploit. I went d5, and then c4, e6, and we get into some type of, Queen's Gambit decline, Catalan looking situation because white now went g3, and this is kind of the beginning of the Catalan. You fianchetto the bishop, you offer the pawn on c4. Not really a sacrifice though, because after d takes e4, white can recover it with queen a4 check, and the argument there is that he'll have more pawns in the center theoretically, at least after a line like this. The argument is that his E and D pawns are a little bit stronger than just my E pawn in the middle of the board, and with the bishop coming down to G2, he might have pressure on the long diagonal. So I've played those systems, but I didn't want to go for that today, and I went knight f6, which is also something I've played before if you've seen any of my games from previous events. Anyways, bishop G2 is normal, very normal move, and now I went bishop E7, continuing in the same vein, just developing, and castles, and now d4 is played. And this is actually kind of the introduction of the mainline Catalan, and I have a decision to make here. If I play d takes c4, that forces a few lines. After d takes c4, there's a4 is a move, queen c2 is a move, and knight e5 is a move. Those are kind of the main 3 moves in the position to try and recover the pawn. In many of these positions, I think white winds up getting the pawn and has a really nice pressure on this diagonal. So I've tended to favor the closed Catalan in recent months, or at least during this time. And so I actually opted for c6. And the idea is, instead of taking on c4 and trying to hold on to a pawn that you're likely not going to be able to hold on to anyway, you just keep this triangle of pawns in the center of the board, which keeps your pawn structure relatively solid and restricts the light squared bishop on the diagonal. Now, the drawback to that is that white still has a little bit more space in the center. So in this type of setup, usually white tries to play for an e4 break eventually to break up my pawn chain and get some of his own active play going. All right, so white went queen c2. This was a move I'd faced a few times before already. In fact, I'd lost a game to David Burgess in my last tournament in the March GMIM Invitational, and I actually came very close to losing, but drew a game in the same tournament against Gauri Shankar. So I actually was kind of well prepared for this one because I had such bad positions in that game that I wanted to try something a little different. So anyways, my try was b6. And this is a move that I think I hadn't played previously. I think I'd gone for knight bd7 type of setups. And I had a new idea in mind in this game. White played knight bd2, which was a move that Gauri had actually played against me. Another option here is for white to play rook d1 and to keep the pressure going on the d file, because I'm not really trying to take on c4, and maybe he can try and open with e4 in a different way, with the knight on c3. One thing I will point out is after b6, knight bd2, This knight has its, its pluses and its drawbacks being on that square. The plus is that it's also guarding the c4 pawn, and from c3 it wouldn't be guarding the c4 pawn. So clearly if I take on c4, knight takes c4, these knights are really pretty. They both are eyeing e5 and d6, some dark squares at my camp, and this bishop has pressure on the long diagonal. However, on d2, the drawback is that it blocks the c1 bishop. So, and it's actually not the most pressing or controlling square in the center. Note that if it was on c3, it would be eyeing d5 and e4, and on d2, it's really just eyeing e4. So because of that, the knight is actually not directly challenging the center, and that's another one of the drawbacks of playing knight bd2. So it's a real debate whether you go knight bd2 or knight c3. I think the main conclusion is that if you go knight c3, you have to be willing to give up the c4 pawn at least temporarily, because you can't recapture it right away. Although in many of these systems, I'm not so sure how great it is to try and hold on to the c4 pawn, because you wind up a lot of times creating more weaknesses than it's worth to create when you do that. So anyways, let me back up to the game. So after knight bd2, I went bishop b7. And this is the beginning of the plan that I kind of envisioned, because in previous tries, I'd actually played my knight very early to d7, and here I thought, well, maybe I don't have to do that. Because the thing you have to look out for right away when the knight comes to d2 and the queen comes to c2 is this e4 break. And so after e4 was played, I was not surprised at all, and I had to make a critical decision. The question was, do I take on e4, or do I allow e5 to be played? Or do I take on c4? So let me rule out a few choices right away. So d takes c4 did not look super attractive to me, because after the move knight takes c4, we kind of have that problem I spoke on before, which is that these knights are really great controlling the dark squares in the center of the board, and white has this nice center. I could go c5 and challenge the e4 pawn, and this is a potential option. But I don't know, I wasn't entirely sure the consequences of e5, knight d5. I mean, it's clear that I have a nice outpost on d5 in the center, and this pawn on e5 might potentially be a weakness rather than a strength later in the game. But in the short term, it gives white a really good initiative against my king side, because he has more space on that front, because he can use the e5 pawn as a wedge. So I just wasn't quite sure what the evaluation of a position like this would be, and I decided not to go for it. The other thing was d takes c4, and this is the move I definitely wasn't going to play, because after d takes c4 and knight takes c4, now this bishop is free to roam, and this knight's on an active square, and if I take again, this queen can actually shift over to the king side, and in the meantime, it actually just stymies my bishop on b7, because the c-pawn is actually pinned. So really, taking on e4, releasing the tension, and giving white this nice space advantage was not what I wanted to do. And as long as my pawn is on d5, this knight on d2 is kind of stuck, because it can't actually go to either square. So I was keen on sort of keeping the status quo. So the answer is I am going to allow e5, and the question was what to do next, and given the fact that I was going to allow e5. Where was my knight on f6 going to go? What was I going to do there? So when I got to this position, I'd realized that my opponent had kind of prepared for me, because I'd had this game earlier in the structure where after e5, I wound up going to e8 with my knight and got a very, very bad position against Gauri Shankar from the Charlotte GMIM Invitational in March. And here, I did not want that same reality where my knight was on e8. It really struggled to get any activity and was just very poor there. So instead, in this position, I decided to play knight a6. And my deal with knight a6 was that I might consider giving the d7 square to my knight as opposed to playing to e8. Again, in a previous game, I played knight bd7, and then on e5, knight e8 was really unfortunate. But now that the square was open, or I left it open, d7 was an option. So anyways, e5 was played, and I was kind of keen on playing knight d7 because I'd looked at it and I thought that was reasonable. And actually, when I got to this position, I started to think, well, maybe there's another option. Maybe I can be even more aggressive. And the more I looked at it, the more I thought, hey, maybe I should go for this just because it would be so unusual. And so in this position, I wound up actually playing knight g4, which seems on the face of it very strange. The knight is, kind of loose there. It's not really protected by anything. But my idea was that if this knight can potentially relocate to the f5 square, well, then it would be a very nice asset, and it would be, influencing the center. It'd be eyeing d4. So I thought maybe my knight on g4 would be more active than my knight on d7. And I thought, hey, it's not so bad, is it? And the more I calculated it, I thought I kind of had reasonable play. So knight b1 was actually played, and I think that's actually forced if you want to punish this knight on g4. The line that I'd calculated was if h3, I can go knight h6, and now the knight just goes back to f5. And note the bishop is blocked, so it can't take me on h6. So really, if you want to punish me, you have to consider knight b1, or you can consider g4 here, actually shutting my knight out this way. But it's kind of double-edged because when you play g4, you've actually loosened up your king side a little bit. And although there's no way I can take advantage of it now, who's to say that won't be the case later? So, g4 is an option, but it's very double-edged. So instead he went knight b1. And now you can see my knight is kind of caught out because on g4, the only square I can actually go to is h6. So pretty much this knight is going to have to go to h6, and, well, isn't bishop takes h6 going to be a problem? Well, I thought about it for a little while, and I thought, well, you know what? I think I can try and drum up some counterplay in the interim before knight h6. And I decided to play knight b4. And this is another idea I had when I brought my knight to a6 in the first place. I thought this knight coming to b4 with tempo could be annoying, nagging this queen on c2. And it turns out that if white wants to protect that pawn on c4, effectively, he needs to move the queen to e2. But once the queen goes to e2, now I have d takes c4. And this was kind of my big idea, was that I actually win a pawn, because if you play queen takes c4 now, I have bishop a6, and I win an exchange on f1. So now white is actually going to be a pawn down for some time, and in return, he does ruin my structure, but we get a very dynamic position where I think there are chances for both sides. Another point about d takes c4 is now the knight has the d5 square in the future, and potentially even the d3 square, because this pawn is on c4 as an anchor. So even though I'm going to ruin my kingside pawn structure, I have pretty good active play. So anyways, white played h3, trying to, spoil my structure, and I went knight h6, and then bishop takes h6, g takes h6 was played. And this was probably the first critical position of the game, because the dust is settled, and I'm a pawn up, which is great, and I have the bishop pair. But on the flip side, you can see my pawn structure is not a site for sword rise on the king side. And the real question is, can white take advantage of it before I activate in the center with my two bishops, or get my play going? So that's really the tug of war. Is the weakness of my kingside pawns going to prevail, or is the two bishops and the extra pawn going to prevail? Very, very interesting question. So white went for knight bd2, trying to attack this pawn on c4, and because again, queen takes c4 queen takes c4 allowed bishop a6. So this knight now taking on c4 would be fine. And now I had a decision to make. Do I defend that pawn, or do I do something else? And when I was looking, I thought, okay, I can play b5 to defend this pawn, but I thought this was a little bit slow and a little bit too greedy, because with b5, I'm weakening a lot of dark squares in my camp, and it also gives white time to potentially play this knight to e4 and get it more weak squares in my position. So to me, I figured I'm up a pawn here, but is it really worth it given, the position in my camp? One thing I always had to be worried about was a move like queen d2 and then queen f4 shifting over to the queen side or to the king side. And, it's hard to even mobilize my double pawns here. So I decided that would not be a good way to play. Instead, I decided to play actively and jettison that pawn. Well, not immediately, but I thought I would need to jettison that pawn soon enough. So anyways, after knight d2, I went b5. And after knight e4, I actually went c5. And this was the whole point of my idea, was I have to give this pawn back. It's hard to actually come up with an active plan if I don't give it back, if I just try to stay materialistic because of this queen d2, queen f4 maneuver. And so with c5, I'm liberating my bishop at the cost of a pawn, and I'm kind of breaking up his duo in the center. I thought this was a really good move. After c5, white went rook d1. I think the reason for that is because if he tries to take the pawn, I have nice active play after either move. If knight takes c5, I go bishop takes c5, giving back my bishop pair. But after d takes c5, I have this really nice move, queen d3, which I believe forces the trade of queens and gets me an endgame that's a little bit more pleasant to play. The point is the queen can't go back to e1 because of knight c2, and this is a fork. And, well, any other move just, ensures that I trade the queens. And also note that my knight coming to d3 is extremely active because it stops this rook from getting to e1 or c1, right, controlling those important squares on the first rank. And it also eyes a lot of white pawns. You can see if you fan out this knight, almost every square I'm hitting something significant. So I thought this position would be very, very good for black, very satisfactory. And so that's why knight takes c5 wasn't played. And if d takes c5, the same deal happens with queen d3, and you can see the queens come up the board, and yeah, I think it's just a reasonable position. So instead, after c5, rook a d1, he is saying, now I'm actually threatening to take on c5 and attack your queen. I went bishop takes c4, getting rid of that knight that was controlling all these, all these pesky squares in the center. And after queen takes e4, I went knight d3. And this was the other, outpost we were talking about before, when on b4 it could go to d5 or d3. And d3 is just a lot better. It's more encroaching on white side of the board. It's also eyeing b2, f2 as well. And I really started to feel quite optimistic here because this pawn center that white has is kind of collapsing, and he hasn't managed to truly attack my king yet. Note that a move like queen g4 check, king h8 doesn't really change very much. This pawns are still kind of loose in the center, and, well, it just doesn't seem like he's getting a lot of pressure on me. At the very least, if he went queen h5, I could go king g7, and I might even have more than that. Maybe I can give him the pawn. So anyways, after queen takes e4, knight d3, white went b3, trying to undermine my knight on d3 because, note, I can't go c takes b3 because my knight would hang. And so it appears that my pawn chain is, kind of collapsing. But note that his is as well. And so after b3, I thought, well, this is kind of a strange move because it does allow me to potentially get a tempo on his rook. And that's what I did. I wound up playing first rook c8 to reinforce my center. And then I was starting to think, well, what about knight b2? Isn't knight b2 an interesting option? Don't I hit this rook and can it not stay on the file because I have c3? So these were things I was thinking about. The reason I started with rook c8, though, was because I wanted to get this rook out of the line of fire of the bishop and the queen on this diagonal. There were some positions where knight d2 or knight h4 unleashed here, and I really just thought the rook was well placed here because it also protects c5, reinforces the c-file, and all that good jazz. So anyways, b takes c4 was played, and I took back with b takes c4, and I'm still a pawn up, and this knight still has remained here as sort of a nice anchor, so everything is good so far. And now white went knight d2, trying to undermine my pawn on c4. And I thought this was a mistake because what it allows is what I followed up with, which is knight b2. And the point is now I hit this rook with tempo, and I'm also hitting this pawn on d4. So it seemed very strange to me that this knight d2 move was played, and I think it's actually just a blunder because now you see there's two things that are loose. White went rook b1 to kind of salvage the position and attack something, because if now the rook is attacking the knight on b2, and if I take on d4, well, he'll take on b2. There are some interesting lines there. I mean, I went c3, but if I go c takes d4, rook takes b2, I could play c3 here, but I thought this would probably fizzle out. I mean, if you go rook c2, c takes d2, rook takes d2, bishop c5, I thought this kind of position would fizzle out. I thought, the material is equal, and the presence of opposite-colored bishops would probably help White's defensive cause a little bit, especially because he could probably blockade on the light squares. And my king is so weak that there's always perpetual check ideas. So I wasn't convinced I could really make hay here. So instead, I went knight b2. After rook b1 and knight b2, I went c3. And I thought this was huge because now I'm protecting this knight on b2, attacking the knight on d2, and I'm still hitting d4. And I just thought his position was kind of collapsing. It seemed like I had an amazing initiative. And note that in the meantime, my weakness, which was my weak king side, has not really been challenged yet. And in the meantime, I've made a lot of hay on the queen side. So anyways, after c3, d5 was played. And d5 really took me... It was just such a huge shock when this move was played. I had actually got up and walked around, and I'd actually thought my position was completely winning. Completely winning. I honestly thought, you know what, I've got him. He's in trouble here. I'm a pawn up. And I just totally missed this move. And this is a brilliant, brilliant try. And once I saw the move, I saw the idea. The point is that after e takes d5, which I do wind up playing, White plays the move queen f5. And there's this really crazy, nebulous threat of knight e4, amazing piece sacrifice, with the point that after d takes e4, bishop takes e4, there's queen h7 mate. And it's kind of hard to get out of because my rook is in the way and my bishop is in the way of a potential escape square on e7. So it's just really, really hard to stop this idea. And I was just totally shocked when I saw this because in this position, I'm 2 pawns up. It looks like I have connected pass pawns coming, and it's just super, super dangerous to contend with. So here I thought and used up most of my remaining time, actually, before the time control, trying to figure out how I can deal with this. And I unfortunately did not come up with the right path. But maybe you will, so I'll give you a chance to pause the video and try to figure out how should black play here, because black is still winning, but it requires very, very precise play. So black to move, think on it. All right, hopefully you got a moment to pause the video and try to figure out what black should do here. In this position, the best move to play is actually rook b8. And rook b8 is just a move that was just beyond me on that day. The idea is that after knight e4 is played, which is the move you need to play to defend that knight, because now that I play rook b8, I'm actually protecting my knight, right? So note that if I played something else, if I went here, then rook takes b2 and he recovers this pawn, and I think that's the idea. But after rook b8, I would defend my knight. So rook b8, and now after knight e4, now here's the key move, because you can see c3 is hanging, and it seems that, well, if I play d takes e4, bishop takes e4 is still a problem. Well, the move here is queen c8, and the idea now is you're actually threatening a queen trade, which actually makes the position decisive. The point is now, after a queen trade, queen takes c8, rook f takes c8. He does get the pawn on c3, but black is still material up. And after d4, these passed pawns that are connected should rule the day, especially with this knight on b2 that's actually surprisingly annoying. And after knight d5, king f8, I've managed to keep everything together, and my pawns can start to roll. Note that, if white doesn't decide to trade queens and try something else like, I don't know, let's say knight f6, check, I can take on f6 now, and after queen takes, I can play a move like queen e6, and try to trade queens and, again, retain my protected passed pawns here. So this would have been the winning path, this queen c8 move, rook b8 and queen c8, and I just did not see that idea. It was just really, really, really tough for me to see. It's kind of an unusual way to try to challenge here on f5. Instead, I played the second best move, which is king g7, and the computers actually still give still give black a tremendous position, like around -1, and they almost want to give it about a winning position, but it's just too difficult to play, in my opinion. After knight e4, which I did expect now, I did take on e4, and after bishop takes e4, my whole point with king g7 now was that I can play rook g8, which is what I wound up playing. The point is that my king has an escape square on f8, and I can kind of run away. Or I can try to, and at least not get checkmated. Believe it or not, the computers actually give rook h8, and this is a move I actually considered, believe it or not, because it seemed to be, again, the only way to defend h7, and in this position, white only has one check, which would be queen g4 check. But the point is that I felt that I'd lost so much coordination here, and the rest of my pawns are so ugly, and so just all my pawns are isolated, that I thought that white could very easily pick up a few pawns and have full compensation for the piece while I lack coordination. And one sample line, which was something I was looking at and worried about, was after rook h8, queen g4 check, king f8, and queen f3, and the point is the c3 pawn will be picked off. I mean, there's no real way to defend that pawn. I could go rook g8. This is the line that is given, and after queen takes e3, it even seems like my knight doesn't have any squares, but fortunately I can run away with knight a4. After knight a4, apparently black is -1 here, but the question you really have to ask yourself is, do you really want to play this position with, limited time on your clock and maybe like 10 moves to make the time control, when it seems like you really don't have a lot of coordination and a lot of your pieces are hanging? For instance, h7 is hanging, a4 is hanging, a7 is a little bit loose, and this rook is coming to d1 very quickly. This rook maybe can come to b7, and I just thought white had a little bit too much counterplay for my taste, well, if I can get the queens off the board, I'd be happy. If I can go like queen d4 and trade queens, I would absolutely play this position. But I was not convinced I could force a queen trade anytime soon, so I just totally rejected this line. So, like I said, instead of rook h8, I went for rook g8, and this actually forces a repetition because after queen takes h7 check, king f8, and queen takes h6, white does recover a few pawns and now has... but even here, white only has a pawn for the piece because I have 1, 2, 3, 4, and and white has an extra pawn on e5, which is the 5th pawn. But I have a very nice strong knight on b2 that's still anchored by this pawn on c3. And so it's really prudent for white to take this draw. And after queen h6 check, I went rook g7 blocking. And after queen h8, rook g8, queen h6, rook g7, we repeated a few times and agreed to a draw here. A very short game, but a very interesting game. I thought I really, was the first one to surprise, which is always a good sign with this really weird knight g4 idea in the opening, headed to h6 and f5. And I thought it was pretty unique and creative. It wasn't something I'd ever seen before. It was just something I kind of came up with over the board. And I kind of pride myself on coming up with new ideas. I think that's one of the fun things about chess is you can find new ideas and, have some new inspiration over the board, and this was certainly an example of that. Now, unfortunately, I wasn't able to, snatch the victory right at the moment where it was necessary, and the d5 move threw me for a whirl. I think in future games, it's important that even when you're winning and you feel like you're winning, just to sit down and sort of see it through, because normally when someone's back is up against the wall, that's when they're going to be the most dangerous. And even in this game, you could see that that d5 move was dangerous and explosive and all those things. And you could tell that Fier was pretty alert in a moment where he had to be. So good job for him for being resourceful and keeping it together. That being said, a draw is a good result. I mean, this is a Grandmaster, no doubt, and a very strong one at that. And, draws with black are always good. So, are almost always good, especially against a strong opponent. So I take it. Anyways, that's it for this one. Thanks for watching. Please like and or subscribe to the channel. And if you want to support the Road to Grandmaster journey, please do so by dropping a donation in the PayPal link in the description below. Thanks. Take care.